Data, one great thing that it does is it eliminates the gap, or at least reduces the gap between visible and invisible disabilities. When we often talk about disabilities, it ends up featuring visible disabilities that are easier to see and easier for people to make amends for, and invisible disabilities get left out. So when you take a database approach, what you're doing is you're accounting for both of these in accordance with the Act to come into play. If you're not counted for, you're not accounted for, right? And that really specifies how we have been underreporting disability within India. We stand at 2.2% right now, while global averages are well above 15%.
Yeah, WHO says 16%. Yeah,
exactly. 1 in 6 people have some sort of disability. So when India comes and says in its census that there's only 2.2% with disability, and maybe the National Family and Health Survey says there's about 4%, but they've also dropped disability questions now, that really raises the question: are we really accounting for people? Are we really reporting the right numbers?
Hello and welcome to the India Autism Center podcast. We are at the International Purple Fest Goa 2025. And I have with me somebody who's doing a lot of work on disability and policy. Naman Khalwani, who leads disability and inclusion at PACTA. Thank you so much for joining us, Naman.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Naman, PACTA has been doing a lot of work on disability, and I don't think we can fit in everything in one small podcast.
Yeah.
But I'm very curious about the work that you're doing specifically in the areas of data and disability, because I always believe that what cannot be measured cannot be corrected, and I think that's been a focus area for PACTA as well. So tell us more.
That's absolutely right. In fact, yesterday I was at the panel for Census 2027 and how we can represent disability there. And while I will get into that later, Mr. Rajiv Rathuri said one thing that really stuck with me, which is if you're not counted for, you're not accounted for, right? And that really specifies how we have been underreporting disability within India. We stand at 2.2% right now, while global averages are well above 15%.
Yeah, WHO says 16%. Yeah,
exactly. 1 in 6 people have some sort of disability. So when India comes and says in its census that there's only 2.2% with disability, and maybe the National Family and Health Survey says there's about 4%, but they've also dropped disability questions now, that really raises the question: are we really accounting for people? Are we really reporting the right numbers? And what we try and do is we try and look at data, we try and collect disaggregated data across various pillars, various sectors where people with disabilities have contact, and see whether there are systems in place to account for people with disabilities, and also whether there's a mandate for collecting data and if that's being done.
No, I think you raised a very important point, because I've always believed that if the census measures disability properly, it'll lead to better budgetary allocations. Right now, just 0.027% of the budget is allocated towards disability. It would lead to the private sector focusing more on disability because they'll realize that it's a bigger market. It'll lead to political parties incentivizing disability and having disability cells as well. So kudos to you raising that point. I think that's an extremely important point. But what really needs to change for data to be taken more seriously in disability? Because I don't think the disability advocacy sector is also talking enough on data and disability, because it's not visible, right?
And that's absolutely right. Data, one great thing that it does is it eliminates the gap, or at least reduces the gap between visible and invisible disabilities. Because when we often talk about disabilities, it ends up featuring visible disabilities that are easier to see and easier for people to make amends for, and invisible disabilities get left out. So when you take a database approach, what you're doing is you're accounting for both of these in accordance with the Act to come into play. Now, our work particularly, we did a report recently on access to justice for people with disabilities, which focused on 4 main pillars with respect to justice. 1, police; 2, prisons; 3rd, courts; and 4th, legal aid clinics.
So section 92 of the RPWD Act actually says that, it's a criminal offense to discriminate against a person with a disability.
Correct.
I don't know of a single FIR that has successfully been filed, and correct me if I'm wrong, under section 92. I have myself gone to police stations under section 92, and police officers did not even know about the existence of this particular section. So what were your takeaways when you did this study, and what else did you find out with respect to the police?
With police, there is a very big lack in data being collected. There is no proper mandates at a state level to collect data. There is no proper mandates at a local police station.
What data are you talking about here?
Data with respect to complaints filed under Section 92 RPWD Act. Data with respect to number of people in contact with police stations, whether it be accused, whether it be people filing complaints, whether it be people being called in for testimony. So we did this study using mostly RTIs because we found that there was no data actually being collected and published by police stations itself. That was so one.
But is that data available on any criminal offense that way with the police in an organized way, which is publicly available?
No. And they are supposed to collect data from a central mandate level with respect to cases filed under Section 92(3), which is not being done. Secondly, one of our sources was RTI data, but secondary sources were also interviews with the police. And what we found through that was often there was no awareness about the mandate for collecting data, but also there were no sensitization programs being held about to police. So even if a sensitization program was held, let's say about women's safety, they would couch it under the bigger garb of a sensitization program and say it's being done for everything.
But I think the problem is actually worse. I don't think they even know what Section 92.
The data says they don't. So that's the conclusion we come to as well.
So basically the data is no data.
Correct.
What is the second thing you spoke about? Prisons, I believe.
Prisons is the second pillar.
Yeah. Tell me a few takeaways from your prisons.
Sure.
What?
Prisons I want to highlight is quite unique as a pillar because what often ends up happening is we don't think of prisoners as people who deserve our comfort, as people that we should think about or we should look.
But there are multiple human rights conventions that.
Of course there are, but there is a lot of stigma when you work with prisoners because a lot of people think these are not the people. They are not providing social utility, which is why we are not going to think of them first. We're going to think of them last. But it's a very different case for prisoners with disabilities because these are people who have no option but to be in contact with the system, right? With respect to police stations, of course, it's great if the police station is accessible to you, but you do not have to live in the police station, right? But for a prisoner with disability, that is your life every single day. And so having data about everything that's happening with respect to accessible infrastructure, with respect to sensitization programs, with respect to availability of prosthetics, with respect to availability of being able to go to court in a van that can fit you or that can allow for you, with respect to being able to be available for hearings or being available to other prisoners around and have some sort of society within the prison itself, there is nothing being collected. And that's why we feel nothing's also being done in that regard because there's nothing to hold accountable. So certain prison manuals, I will say this, have a mandate for data being collected. These are the more recent prison manuals. However, in several prisons in India, and that's more than 50%, the prison manuals and jail manuals are from the colonial era. So we're talking about 1920s and 1919 jail manuals reflecting in most of the prisons in India. And only some of the either newer prisons or prisons which face a lot of population like Tihar jail where there are newer manuals being created.
I've done the accessibility audits at a couple of prisons in Delhi a few years back.
Yes,
yeah, I remember us chatting about it. And so I'm not talking about from data, but I'm talking from personal experience of interacting with prisoners.
Yeah.
They actually spoke about the fact that they did not even have proper washrooms, etc., which were accessible to. Is this a common trend amongst prisons in India?
This is a common trend amongst prisons in India. Some newer prisons which are being formulated are being created keeping in mind people with disabilities, but that's very few. So it would be maybe 2 or 3. I can't remember names at the top of my head. But you're right, most prisons don't have, it's only about 11% of the prisons responded with an affirmative to having reasonable accommodation for prisoners with disabilities.
You also spoke about courts in this particular study. Tell us more about...
Courts is an interesting one because courts is what we think is the highest, sort of the most sophisticated branch of government in some sort. Not branch of government, but a form of official status. And we see several things being done at Supreme Court, at some of the more modern high courts. We see there are accessibility reports, there are accessibility committees, there is data being collected.
And that's also very recent, right?
That is recent. Most of this data is from 2023 onwards, even though the mandate existed from 2016. But we are seeing an increase, and we are seeing courts like Kerala doing really well. We're seeing courts like Assam and those in Jammu and Kashmir doing really well, which have accessible infrastructure, which allow people with disabilities to appear before courts and to file cases in a way that is accessible to them, right? So there is a lot of good work happening in some courts. About 18 of the 25 courts that we have a mandate for collecting data. About 12 to 13 of these courts publish a report on the data being collected. So we know that some
When you're talking about data, you're talking about data of how accessible they are?
Data for how accessible they are, data for how many cases are filed by people with disabilities and how many cases are filed against people with disabilities. And also sensitization. When I talk about accessibility, it's not just infrastructure in terms of ramps and wheelchairs, but also translators, interpreters, sign language interpreters, and so on.
I'm glad you mentioned that point. Because there are a couple of courts that have also prioritized disability in their roster, right? So that disability cases come up. Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about that and which courts have been working well on that?
At the top of my head, I don't remember the exact courts that are doing great work on that, but there is an increase. So in Kerala, there is more online courts being held, which are called on courts. And what that does is that basically allows people with disability to file their petitions and appear for them much easier because it's done online. But we often conflate the two. We think online means accessible. And that's where I think there needs to be a line drawn that online is not accessible for everyone. Kerala, sure, is a standout because they do claim that they have over 99% digital literacy. But we cannot just take it at face value that online is equal to accessible. And I think that's a takeaway we need to have.
UNICEF did a study recently on juvenile justice homes and disability and juvenile justice in general.
Right.
And one of their main takeaways I remember from it was a detailed study was that there was a lack of sign language interpreters because of which a lot of justice was denied. Have courts started taking steps in terms of providing sign language interpreters as well?
Not in the data we found. In fact, we have, I heard of a story from a Delhi High Court advocate just today where a sign language interpreter was picked up in a police van from his daughter's wedding to come and interpret for a case. Now, this is an employee
who's not very inviting.
Exactly. And that leads to more people shying away from jobs like that because they think they can be called up at any time. And when a police van is taking you from your home, most people are going to think you're arrested.
I actually know of another sign language interpreter who was issued official summons to land up.
Exactly.
So yeah, this happens often. Yeah.
Yeah. So while things like this may look decent on paper, where they say, "Oh, we have made a sign language interpreter available to this person," what the reality is that this interpreter is unlikely to come back, which means you're actually losing out on more people who can come assist.
So what can courts do to become accessible? What is a model court to you?
There are several things involved in this. Number one, so our study has been very data driven. And one thing that we highlight on is that data needs to be recorded about a lot of these indicators that we've highlighted. And we've also issued a checklist in terms of how they should be highlighted. Now, I'm not saying that's where the buck stops, but that is the first step for accountability so that you have a checklist of what you need to ensure you're doing. The next step from that is to build forward, right? Because what we end up doing is we say, sure, we have accessible ramps and we have accessible toilets, but it doesn't account for people with invisible disabilities. It doesn't account for people who need different sort of accommodation. So the courts need to actually be available to the people in a way which is most accessible to them. It cannot be their benchmark of accessibility where they say, I've made a ramp, I've made accessible toilets, and therefore I'm an accessible court. Unless someone is able to come in and file a petition with the same ease, and I say ease with double quotes, as a person without disability or someone who identifies as being able-bodied, then they're not accessible.
The fourth pillar that you spoke about in your report was legal aid clinics. Can you tell us a bit about that as well?
Sure. Legal aid clinics are linked to courts because in India, so the Delhi High Court will have the Delhi Legal Services Authority, which will set up a legal aid clinic. Similarly, each state will have their legal aid clinics. Karnataka is doing great work in that in terms of they have people who are sign language interpreters or translators available.
Our viewers might not know what is a legal aid clinic. Can you first explain what is a legal aid clinic for the benefit?
So a legal aid clinic is where someone who has any sort of difficulty, there are parameters laid out, women, people under poverty, people with disabilities, and so on, can go and access legal aid clinics to file petitions for them for free or get legal advice for free, right? That's what a legal aid clinic does. A legal aid clinic you will generally find in most district courts and high courts, as well as the Supreme Court of India. These are created by the Legal Services Authority of each of these. NALSA, the National Legal Services Authority, is one of the popular ones that we hear about, who files a lot of cases for people with disabilities and gets favorable judgments in the Supreme Court. So these are avenues which allow access to justice for people who may be marginalized or disadvantaged.
But how do you ensure that a lawyers who are in the legal aid clinic are even sensitized towards disability.
So that's one good thing that's happening, is because the legal aid clinics talk to, are constantly in contact with a lot of people from marginalized communities. They are made aware of these issues, right? We see this often even in general parlance, where a lot of common folk may be well-intentioned or maybe just oblivious to certain things, do not know about how to make certain things accessible, or do not know how to talk to someone maybe who has an intellectual disability, right? But because people in legal aid clinics talk to people with disabilities often, they automatically get sensitized and then go ahead and raise more sensitization programs or awareness programs. So in Tumkur in Karnataka, there is a record number of sensitization programs being held every year, which means that they're actually making an effort, taking a step forward in talking about various types of disabilities that people may account. So you cannot even think about just one particular sort of disability and say we held a sensitization program and it's over. You need to inform people of it's different to talk to someone who's visually impaired versus someone who may have autism. And a person who is in a legal aid clinic needs to be aware of that.
So amongst the 4 pillars, this is the pillar which is going right, is what you're saying.
This is the pillar which is doing great. The main issue which is doing great in terms of anecdotal experiences that we've seen. In terms of data, again, there are some misses, because while there is clearly a mandate for collecting data, both under the RPWD Act and under these specific local acts, right? But some of this data is not being collected great in several states. So there is still a lot to be done on the data front.
So it's a bit skewed if it's some states doing well and others not so well.
Correct. So that's the results we often get. Some states are doing great, some states need some work.
So if you were the law minister of India after this study, what are the 2 or 3 changes that you would make?
I mean, I'd be happy with the promotion firstly, but there's obviously several things. There's issues regarding guardianship. There's issues regarding data protection. What I would do is I would ensure that every legislation that is passed in the country from here on takes into account people with disabilities at its inception, rather than trying to retrofit that post facto. So
But anything specific on these 4 areas that you would do?
Of course. So that's number one, is to make legislation which thinks about people with disability at first. With respect to these pillars, I would ensure data collection through maybe a central or a state-specific mandate. So mandate already exists, but we need maybe a processing office which allows this collection of data and is looking and making sure that data is being collected. I think that is what is the need of the hour, which will then take forward to us making policy decisions about people with disabilities with proper knowledge of how many people are actually in contact with these systems, how many people want to be in contact with these systems but aren't because they are inaccessible.
And the mandate exists as per the RPWD Act, as what
it does. It does in several places.
So basically the law is saying that we need to collect this data, but
Correct.
This country is violating this law clearly.
Correct. So Article 31 of the United Nations Conventions of Rights of People with Disabilities, as well as RPWD Act Section 25, both have a mandate for collecting data for the very purpose of creating policy in accordance with the data collected. So the reason is also very clear, but there is a violation of that happening, and that violation is not going checked.
If any of your viewers are curious about this report that you guys have done, where can they read it? So
we just launched a microsite on pacta.in. If you can just Google search PACTA, Access to Justice for Persons with Disabilities, you'll be coming to the microsite, which has an accessible version of the report as well.
I've taken a lot of time, but I'm going to ask you one final question that I've been asking everybody. What do you think can the common citizen of this country do to make India a more equal opportunity country for persons with disabilities?
I think just be more aware and inclusive. I think I have made this mistake myself, where until there is someone in your family or someone you're close to who has a disability, you don't look at things that are problematic till you come to that realization yourself, till it hits you personally. So I think if we can just take a step, try and raise more awareness, try and make ourselves more aware about various issues that people face, then I think we can be more inclusive overall.
Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Nipur.
Yeah.
Thanks.